Look at that. Look at that clip very carefully, because the internet has been on fire arguing about what you just watched, and tonight on Street Hoops, we are going to settle it. We are going to go through every single detail, every timeline fact, every piece of documented evidence around what actually happened to Caitlin Clark on the night of June 24th, 2026. And we are going to give you the truth, not the conspiracy, not the hot take that gets clicks by attacking a coach with no evidence, the truth. Because in a story that already has enough real drama, and trust me, there is plenty of real drama here, there are people on the internet trying to add a layer that is not there. And when you mess with the actual facts of a real injury to a real player, you do a disservice to the very person you claim to be defending. What is good, everybody? I am your host, Dre Fiver. Welcome back to Street Hoops, and tonight we are going deep into the back injury saga, what happened, when it happened, how long it has been building, and what it means for the Indiana Fever going forward. And along the way, we are going to address the theories circulating online about this exit head on, because some of them need to be corrected with facts before they get any further. Let's get into it. Let me start from the very beginning of this story, because the back injury that took Caitlin Clark off the floor on Wednesday night did not start on Wednesday night. Not even close. This has been a storyline since literally the first game of the 2026 NBA season. On May 9th, in the Fever's season opening loss to the Dallas Wings, Caitlin Clark temporarily exited the game in the middle of the contest, went back to the locker room, and returned to the bench wearing a wrap around her back. When reporters asked her about it after the game, Clark herself explained what happened. She said her back gets out of line pretty quickly and she had to go get it adjusted, get it put back in place. Those are her own words. Not injury report language, not a media relations statement. The player herself told reporters on the record that her back has been an ongoing management situation since game 1 of this season. That is your starting point. That is the foundation of this entire story. From that first game forward, Stephanie White, Clark's head coach, also addressed it publicly and honestly. White said at the time that this was going to be an ongoing thing for Clark, that it was not exclusive to Clark, but affected multiple players on the roster, and that the process involves getting adjusted, making sure the body is aligned, keeping hip alignment and rib alignment in check. She said it is part of being a professional athlete. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just a coach being transparent about managing a player through a physical issue that has been present from day one. And from that point on, Clark appeared on the Indiana Fever's official injury report for 13 consecutive games leading into the Wednesday matchup against Phoenix. 13 straight games listed as probable with back soreness. Not questionable, not doubtful. Probable, meaning she was expected to play and did play, but the issue was real enough that the league required the Fever to formally list it. That is not a secret. That is not a cover-up. That is the official injury reporting mechanism of the WNBA doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Now, fast forward to Wednesday, June 24th. Clark enters the game listed as a game time decision due to the lingering back ailment. And here is the first detail that I want you to lock into your brain, because it is critical to understanding everything that happens later that night. In the first quarter, before the Alyssa Thomas incident, before the Valerian Ayayi closeout, before the third quarter exit, Caitlin Clark goes back to the tunnel during the game and returns to the bench wearing a wrap around her back. First quarter, before any of the controversial plays. The back was already being managed that night before the game was even 10 minutes old. The training staff was already working on her. She came back out and played. The wrap was visible. This is documented by multiple wire service reports. This is not disputed by anyone who was in the building or covered the game in real time. Clark's back was a factor in this game from the opening tip, and the training staff was on it from the first quarter. Then the second quarter happens, and you know what happens in the second quarter because we have covered it extensively on this channel already. 6 minutes and 52 seconds left. Alyssa Thomas puts a knee into Clark's groin, drives a fist into her throat, and steps on her body, using her as leverage to get up. No call. Then, with 6 minutes and 25 seconds remaining, Phoenix's Valerian Ayayi closes out recklessly on Clark's three-point attempt, gets underneath her, and Clark lands on Ayayi's feet and goes to the floor. Clark grabs at her back as she stands up. She is visibly uncomfortable walking back to Indiana's bench, but she makes all 3 free throws on that play, and she stays in the game. She continues playing through it. In the second quarter alone, Caitlin Clark took a fist to the throat, a reckless landing closeout, and she still finished the half, still made free throws, still contributed. That is not a player who is looking for an exit. That is a competitor gutting through a situation that would have sent most players to the bench immediately. Now, let me walk through exactly what happens in the third quarter, because this is the sequence that has social media arguing and that requires a clear factual breakdown. Clark is on the floor to start the third quarter. She gets a couple of assists. She hits a three-pointer, and it is a good one, a deep pull-up, the kind of confident shot that says she is locked in and competing. The game is close. Everything is tight. And then she turns the ball over. The Mercury convert the turnover in transition. The ball goes the other way. It results in an easy basket, and the game is suddenly tied at 67. Stephanie White calls timeout. This is a critical and entirely normal coaching decision in a close game after a momentum-shifting turnover. Coaches call timeouts after transition baskets all the time. That is not a punishment. That is basketball management at the professional level. Clark comes out of the game at the timeout. And from that huddle, Clark heads to the locker room and does not return. The Fever announce a back injury as the official reason before the third quarter is even over. Now, here is where I need to be very direct, because there is a theory circulating online suggesting that the back injury was not real, that Clark was actually benched by Stephanie White after the turnover and left in frustration, and that the back injury was a cover story. And I am going to dismantle that theory piece by piece with documented facts, because the people spreading it are not doing Caitlin Clark any favors by putting that narrative into the world. First fact, Clark was listed as probable on the official injury report going into the game with a documented back issue that had been on the report for 13 consecutive games. 13. This is not something that appeared after the fact to justify her exit. It was disclosed in advance publicly through the league's official reporting mechanism. Second fact, in the first quarter of the same game, well before any controversial plays occurred and well before any turnover happened, Clark left the court, went to the tunnel, and returned wearing a back wrap. The training staff was treating her back before halftime. That is documented in the Associated Press game report, in multiple television broadcasts, in wire service coverage from outlets including NBC Sports, ABC News, and multiple others. If the injury was fabricated as an excuse for being benched in the third quarter, somebody needs to explain why the training staff was already wrapping her back in the first quarter. Third fact, Clark grabbed at her back visibly after the Ayayi closeout foul in the second quarter and was reported as uncomfortable walking back to the bench by multiple journalists sitting courtside. That is documented in real time reporting from people physically present at Gainbridge Fieldhouse, not retroactive spin. Fourth fact, and this is the one that matters most, Clark was accompanied to the locker room by training staff. The Hardwood Heroics game report, citing direct observation, states clearly that Clark walked to the locker room accompanied by training staff. The claim that she walked off alone with no trainers around her is not supported by the evidence. Training staff was present. They walked with her. That is how professional sports handle injury exits. Now I want to be fair about why questions arose in the first place, because I think the confusion is understandable even if the conclusion people reached is wrong. The broadcast was slow to give information. For a stretch of time during the third quarter and beyond, the television commentary did not provide a clear, definitive explanation of what was happening with Clark. When a major star exits a game and the broadcast goes quiet about it for an extended period, questions are going to fill that vacuum. That is human nature. That is how sports media consumption works in the social media era. The absence of information gets filled by speculation, and in the current environment around Caitlin Clark, where every incident involving her carries an existing charge of drama and controversy, that speculation moves faster and louder than in almost any other story in sports. I get it. I understand why people were asking questions. Asking questions is fine. The problem is when questions become declarative statements. When something seems off, becomes Stephanie White is covering up a benching on the basis of zero evidence and in direct contradiction of documented facts. And here is the part where I need to speak directly, as Dre Fiver, about the impact of that kind of content on the real people involved. Stephanie White is Caitlin Clark's head coach. She's also the coach who stood at a podium after that same game and went to war for Clark publicly, calling the no calls on her star player absolutely egregious, absolutely unacceptable, saying the fist in the throat was crazy and dangerous. Saying Clark is not officiated the same way as everyone else. She brought the Thomas incident to the officials at halftime. She went to bat for Clark harder and more publicly and more directly than any coach in the WNBA has gone to bat for any player all season. To turn around and accuse that same coach of staging a cover-up to hide a benching with no evidence against documented facts is not an analysis. It is a story that gets clicks at the expense of a real person's reputation, and it takes the focus off the actual story, which is dramatic and outrageous and important and does not need to be embellished with anything false to hold your attention. Let me tell you what the actual story is, because it is genuinely alarming enough on its own. Caitlin Clark entered Wednesday's game with a documented pre-existing back issue that has been managed since day one of this season. She entered the game listed as probable, not fully healthy. During the first quarter, she needed to go back to the tunnel to have her back treated and came back wearing a wrap. Then, in the second quarter, she took a fist to the throat and was subjected to a reckless closeout that sent her to the floor, grabbing her back. She continued playing through all of that. She continued competing. She hit threes. She distributed. She gave the Fever everything she had for 20 minutes of basketball while managing a pre-existing injury that was being aggravated in real time by contact that the referees refused to call. And then, in the third quarter, her back gave out to the point where she could no longer continue, and she was accompanied to the locker room by the training staff and ruled out for the remainder of the game. The real question, the question that matters, that has actual weight and actual consequence, is not whether Stephanie White benched her. It is whether Caitlin Clark should have been playing at all on Wednesday night, given the state of her back coming in, and whether the physical contact she absorbed during the game, which the referees chose not to address, contributed to her condition worsening to the point where she could not finish. That second question is genuinely serious. The Ayayi closeout, the one where Clark landed on her feet while shooting a three and went to the floor grabbing her back, was reviewed by the officials on the monitor during the game. Reviewed on replay. And not upgraded to a flagrant. Not even upgraded. Meanwhile, Clark's back was already wrapped, she was already on the injury report, and the league knew all of this context. A player with a documented back injury takes a reckless closeout that sends her to the floor, grabbing at her back. The officials review it, and they wave it off. That is the story. That is the outrage, not the conspiracy. Now, let me talk about what this back injury means going forward for the Fever, because the timing of this is genuinely concerning from a playoff and standings perspective. Indiana entered Wednesday's game at 10 wins and 8 losses, 3rd in the Eastern Conference, 7th in the league overall. Clark herself had been on an absolute tear leading up to this game, according to multiple reports. She had scored at least 21 points in 6 straight games coming in, including a 32-point performance with a near triple-double in a recent overtime win against Chicago. She was the leading scorer in the WNBA with 265 points on the season and led the league with 108 assists. That is a player operating at an elite level, managing a back issue, and somehow still putting up historic individual numbers. When a player at that level, carrying that kind of production load, exits a game and the team has no return timetable, that is a serious situation for a franchise fighting for positioning. The schedule, however, does present a small window of opportunity. After the Saturday game against the Los Angeles Sparks on June 27th, the Fever have a full week off before returning to action on July 5th. That gap in the schedule, if Clark can use it to rest, receive treatment, and allow her back to settle, could be the difference between a brief absence and a prolonged one. Stephanie White addressed this after the game, saying the team has to be careful and that it is a long season. She treated it exactly the way a responsible coach treats a chronic injury, acknowledging the reality without creating unnecessary alarm. That is what good injury management looks like. Not a cover-up, not a conspiracy, a coach being measured and careful with her most important player. And I want to zoom out for a moment and put this in the context of everything we have covered on this channel over the last several days, because the back injury is not an isolated event. It is the latest chapter in a story that has been building all season. Caitlin Clark has been managing this back issue since game 1. She has been physically targeted in multiple games with insufficient protection from the officials. The Alyssa Thomas incident, the throat punch that resulted in a 1-game suspension that most people, myself included, considered wildly inadequate, directly preceded her back flaring up enough to take her off the court. Whether that specific sequence was the tipping point, or whether it was the Ayayi closeout, or whether it was the accumulated physical toll of the entire game on a back that was already compromised going in, all of those things are connected. They are all part of the same picture. And the picture is of a player who is fighting through real physical limitations, competing at an elite level, absorbing contact that the league is supposed to protect her from, and now sitting out of games that Indiana needs to win. Let me also address the credential situation that adds another uncomfortable layer to this story, because it speaks to the environment around the Fever's injury reporting. There was an earlier incident this season, back in May, around the time Clark missed the Portland game, where the Fever received an official warning from the NBA for improper injury reporting. Because Clark was not listed on the official report before the late scratch designation, the league went after the team's reporting process. Now, in that same situation, Clark herself went on record afterward saying she had every intention of playing and was treating it as a day of decision. So here's the irony that I want Street Hoops Nation to sit with. The NBA formally warned the Fever for not listing Clark's injury soon enough on the official report, essentially demanding more transparency about her physical status. And yet, when Clark exits a game with a documented, pre-existing, officially reported injury while accompanied by training staff, the conversation on social media becomes it's a cover-up. You cannot have it both ways. Either the injury is real and documented and part of a season-long management situation, or the entire thing is manufactured. And when the evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction, injury reports, training staff presence, visible back-grabbing, first-quarter tunnel visits, the player's own public statements about her back from the season opener onward, then the evidence is what we should be reporting, not the opposite. The bigger issue that I want to leave you with, and this is the one that genuinely keeps me up at night as someone who wants to see this league succeed, is what this back injury situation represents in terms of risk. Caitlin Clark is now playing through a chronic back issue in a league where the officiating has repeatedly failed to protect her from physical contact. She is coming into games already listed as probable, already needing treatment before tip-off, already wearing a wrap by the first quarter, and then during those games, she is taking knees to the groin, fists to the throat, and reckless closeouts that send her to the floor. The league addresses these things after the fact, post-game reviews, one-game suspensions, the minimum viable response, but in the moment, in real time, the whistle is silent. And every moment that whistle stays silent while Clark is on a compromised back is a moment that puts the long-term health of this league's most important player at risk. Stephanie White said something after the game that I keep coming back to, and I think it might be the most important line anyone has spoken in this entire saga. She said that when these things continue to happen time and time and time again, eventually it gets frustrating. That is a coach who has spent an entire season asking for consistency, asking for her player to be called the same way everyone else is called, asking for the officials to protect her generational talent, and she is standing at a podium after a loss, after 2 cheap shots on her star, after her star has been helped off the court with an injury, and she is saying, eventually it gets frustrating. Not I am filing a complaint, not the league is corrupt. Eventually it gets frustrating. That is the language of a professional who has been patient far longer than she probably should have been, and who is now watching the cumulative cost of that inadequate protection show up in her player's body. The frustration is not with Caitlin Clark. The frustration is with a system that has repeatedly failed to do its job, and a player who is now paying a physical price for that failure. What we need from the WNBA at this point is not another post-game suspension press release. What we need is a structural shift. We need officials who call these plays in real time, who have the awareness and the courage to blow the whistle when the league's most important player is being physically targeted, who do not let a fist to the throat and a knee to the groin slide because they did not see it clearly. We need a league that treats the protection of its franchise player with the same urgency that the NFL treated the protection of its franchise quarterbacks. Not because Clark is more important than any other player as a human being. Every player in that league deserves to be protected equally, but because the economic and cultural stakes of losing Clark to injury are enormous. And the league has an obligation to its own future to take those stakes seriously. And right now, watching Clark get wrapped in the first quarter, watching her grab her back in the second, watching her exit in the third, it does not feel like those stakes are being taken seriously. It feels like the league is doing the minimum and hoping the problem does not get worse. That is the story. That is the real, documented, factual, and genuinely alarming story of what happened on the night of June 24th. Not a coaching conspiracy, not a staged benching. A player with a real, chronic, officially reported back injury absorbed repeated physical contact in an environment where the officials called nothing, and eventually her body told her it was done for the night. That is what happened. And the people who want to build drama by inventing a fictional conflict between Clark and her coach, the coach who went to war for her publicly at a podium after that same game, are pulling attention away from the real accountability story, which is the league's ongoing failure to protect the most valuable asset in women's professional basketball. Caitlin Clark has a back that has been managed since May. She entered Wednesday's game already compromised. She had training staff work on her in the first quarter. She took a throat punch and a reckless closeout and played through both. She competed for 20 minutes before her body gave out, and she is now in Indianapolis on a back that has been on the injury report for 13 consecutive games, waiting to see if she can play on Saturday against the Sparks. That is where we are. And the only story worth telling about it is the one that asks how we got here, who is responsible, and what the league is going to do about it before this gets any worse. All right, Street Hoops Nation, that is all from me today, and I need everything from you in the comments right now. Did you buy the conspiracy theory when you saw those clips, or did the facts always point to a real injury? How worried are you about Clark's back situation heading into the rest of this season? And the big question, is the WNBA's failure to protect Clark in real time going to cost this league something it cannot get back? Drop all of it below. I read every comment, and this is the kind of conversation that matters. If this video gave you the full picture and you are not subscribed yet, hit that button right now. We do this every single time a major story breaks, and we never cut corners on the truth. Smash that like button if you think the real story here is about the league's accountability, not a fake coaching conspiracy. Share this with somebody who has been hearing the theories and needs the facts. I am Dre Fiver. This is Street Hoops. No filter, no agenda, nothing but the truth as we see it. Until next time, protect the stars or lose the league. Stay up, everybody.